Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy. Today is going to be a very nice and chill Q&A, and you can ask me, a philosopher, questions, right? And maybe you don't have questions and you'd like to make a statement, or maybe your question is at the bottom of the list and you'd like to donate to get seen, and you can do that by using the link in the description as well. So, yeah. But let's say you don't want to do that. And let's say you just want to ask a question. Well, the easiest way to do that is to just drop it in chat. And I will answer your question as soon as I get to it. First come, first serve. Oh, I've just pinned your question there, man. Sorry, I'll answer that. I was meant to pin this. There we go. Okay. Am I still an anarchist? In the past, you said you are, but that you hadn't read any. I said that I was sympathetic mostly to anarcho-syndicalism, and I was a fan of the anarchy as put forth by, or the form of anarchy put forth by Chomsky, which was mostly a kind of decentralized power structure, very much democratic. I wouldn't consider myself an anarchist now. I'm more of a communitarian. I think that depending upon, ideological goals, I would like a more decentralized, structured state in which the goodness of the individual actors, or rather the virtue of the individual actors, is a necessary prerequisite for the functioning of the state, that the state vests more power in the individual, and likewise the individual is able to trust the state. That'd be great. But I think what we need there is an ideological change rather than just the change of a political mechanism. So I'd call myself a communitarian now. I think there's like appropriate forms of government dependent upon the constitution of the people, rather than one size fits all approach. But thank you very much for your question. I'm very much interested in the philosophy of people like Alistair McIntyre specifically, when it comes to political philosophy. And Hegel and Aristotle. So that everyone know that we're live. What do I think of Aquinas? PP is 15 minutes late. Well, glad to mock him for it. Absolutely. I love Aquinas. I'm a big fan of Thomas Aquinas. I think he's a great philosopher. I just think that he's... I think that the only problems I have with Aquinas is really the lack of... Well, really the objectivity, the way in which he perceives reality is very like object-orientated, where I wouldn't endorse that kind of ontology necessarily. And instead I would take a more post-Kantian approach, someone like Hegel. Do you support capital punishment for oppression of non-human animals? Do I support capital punishment? You mean like killing people because of them killing animals? No, I don't. I don't support capital punishment in general. So, yeah, like, I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you. Mainly for the fact that I think we all should be given the opportunity to change and seek mercy. And so, and to quote Shakespeare, what is it? We doth pray for mercy, and that prayer for mercy should teach us to render the deeds of mercy. I think I think that's it, really. I think that we need to be able to give mercy to individuals and let them seek salvation, even murderers. I mean, I don't think they should ever get out of prison for until they die, but I think that we should, give them mercy by not murdering them back. Well, we're not killing them. In terms of why I would in terms of approaching that in terms of animal agriculture, it doesn't make sense to treat people who kill animals as murderers. They don't understand largely the harm they're doing. I think what is it Christ on the cross? Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. We're all morally ignorant to varying extents, and I think that veganism is a blind spot for the majority of the population. Council communism. I mean, I'm not a fan of communism in general. It depends on what you mean by council communism. I've never really heard of that specifically. Could you elaborate? Capital punishment has its upsides. Yeah, I mean, it does and it doesn't. There's economic upsides, but I think ultimately economics is secondary. I mean, at the same time, we need to make sure that we'll prevent these crimes from happening in the first place as largely as much as possible. And certain ideological frameworks are better at that than others. Ones which promote respect and love for one another. But you'll always get criminals, and they always have to be met with force, such that you even respect that their rationality for acting as essentially an opposition to the state rationality, and so the state must crush them and put them in line in order to respect them and bring them back into the fold. So I would say ultimately punishing murderers is essential, but that as much as I want our God to be merciful to me, I should be willing to pity others and grant the same mercy in return. But welcome, Miss K, R, Proclon, Harden, Epic, Shadow. Nameless. Aaron. If you don't have the resources, then I suppose then your hands are tied in many ways. So if you can't keep someone alive, but they're going to be a continued threat to other individuals, then execute them. That's about all you can do. I mean, what's the alternative? Let them go free? Why are you religious without any proof of the existence of God? Religion can have positive aspects that come from secular forces, while religion has uniquely bad things. Spiritualism influences your thinking. Well, I mean, there is evidence for the existence of God. I would look towards, for example, the principle of sufficient reason as given by Leibniz. The arguments outlined in terms of ontology for Hegel. So that's a combination of a teleological argument and an argument from sufficient reason, such that it then reinforces what Hegel takes to be the ontological argument. So I would see there was evidence for the existence of God. Quite the contrary. I'm pretty good. I record. How are you, man? I've heard Peter Hitchens argue that it's shown to stranger murder, people murdering specifically to cover up theft or lesser crimes. I don't know about that. I mean, I'd have to look into it. And I think it would vary depending upon the state. What we typically find is that the biggest thing that deters criminals isn't the severity of the punishment, but the effectiveness of law enforcement. How likely are you to get caught? And how do you believe you are likely to get caught in general? Um, and some people will think they'll never get caught, even if they were going to get caught like from the absolute get go. Arrogance and narcissism and all that tied into the kind of criminal mind. But when we think about, like 25 years, 30 years life without parole versus capital punishment, a lot of the criminals who are committing these crimes don't actually believe they'll get caught at all. So they don't see it as a consequence for their actions. And I think that the reformers the judicial reformers around the sort of 17th century had the best attitude that we shouldn't have this one size fit all punishment policy, right? Murder is one thing because obviously you've kind of just got to keep them away from everyone until they die because of safety. But also they've lost all subjectivity. But even when they saw murder, they saw it as like the way that you should punish them was to suspend them above the town square and let them face the brutality of the elements. So it's like if you're gonna reject the state, well, we'll subject you to the force of nature, like let you starve to death and such like that. But the way that the reformers really thought of this was, in general, to irritate the desire at the point of action, such that the idea of the punishment at the point of the consideration of the act would irritate the desire for acting. So if someone is to commit a crime out of being greedy, let's say they're a thief, then you will impoverish them. If they're going to commit a crime in order to, let's say, bolster their reputation, you'll force shame upon them. You irritate the desire with its negation. And I think that is an interesting way to approach criminality, such that if we were to remove essentially this, especially the prison system, the way that the prison system works is very much a one size fits all approach, and I'm very much not in favor of that. Communism is just another monetary system. No, it's not. That's not. I mean, there's like, there's the economics, like the economist side of things, but there's also the ideological, philosophical, and political side of things of how you run the state, how you understand agents in between each other, like essentially how you legislate and so on, and even like moving economics away from that is sort of nonsense. It's a competing ideology. It can't be just taken as a different money system, as you say. I mean, I'd love for a Star Trek economy, 100%. I really would love Star Trek to happen. I don't think Star Trek's communist, though. I think it's sometimes thought of as upper stage communism, kind of outlined by people like Trotsky and Lenin in that sort of utopian ideals. But I think if you look at the values that are expressed in Star Trek, that almost exclusively liberal and Christian, really, sort of origin, not communist. They're democratic, for example. They the form of democracy is they have the democracy is not essentially like party structured in the way that it is from what it seems to be in the way that it is in communism. There's no specific ideological allegiances that are necessary for the state. Like they embrace a kind of multiculturalism and like or even like multiple competing value sets, but under an umbrella of a kind of tolerance, that sort of liberalism. Yeah, I mean, like I just think of Star Trek as a liberal utopia. That's basically what it is. With the kind of with but post scarcity. Yeah, I mean, it does abolish currency in the same way as communism, actually, Miss K. That is a way in which it is influenced by communism. I can say that, like, they do abolish currency, but I think all post scarcity economies would also abolish currency. there's no need for it. It would just fall apart. Like, there's no scarcity, so there's no need for the kind of monetary system. Does your derivation of the relations of the Trinity or the other night necessarily lead to Christianity or just deism, but with a general Trinitarian idea of God? Is there a next step to take? I'd say it's necessarily Christian. I don't think there's anything, I don't think it's necessarily compatible with any other religion. God has to be personal, given this perspective. God has to be all-loving, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. And he also has to, so it's Trinitarian. It applies the divine attributes, and implies essentially the Christian ethic of love, I would argue. So, as essentially the golden rule, as essentially the guiding force, or the highest commandment, to love God and to love each other would be the highest commandment there. So I think it necessarily implies Christianity. How would a capitalist society bring about a Star Trek future without going further than all liberal economic thought so far? It wouldn't. Absolutely, it wouldn't. I'm very much I used to call myself a socialist a lot. I'm very much about moving beyond this sort of economic system. I think we necessarily have to, and I think it would be for the good of all humanity. But I think that the way you move beyond any system in general is to see it out to its logical end, and it will imply its negation in order to mediate and resolve it. And I think we're going to bounce between various market structures until we'll find a better and better one. Meanwhile, we'll technologically develop such that the market structures will begin to be modified by the technology as well. So it's not something that I can sort of predict in a sort of linear path where I go, okay, now we're going to be liberal, now we're going to be socially democrat, then socialist, then communist, or anything like that. I think that there's going to be movements on both sides, backwards and forwards, in a dialectical pattern, if you will. And I don't think that I think that what will probably end up happening will give too much power to the government and civil society, will give too much power to the market, and we'll have various forces moving one way or the other. So yeah, that's the way I see it really kind of developing. And that's not, look, we haven't even considered there's technologies that haven't even been thought of yet that are going to influence the development of society. But I do think that we are progressing morally towards a more respectful and loving society globally. I do think that we'll have our pitfalls and we'll have our problems, but we're getting there. I find it hard to believe, PP, that in New York City they had tens of thousands of shoplifting incidents caught and let go. It was done by a couple of hundred individuals, dozens of incidents per thief. Yeah, I mean, that's a problem, and it does show that in some cases, the punishments need to be either more severe or more fitted to the crime. And also that there's social issues and social ills that are maybe promoting and leading to certain sort of forms of criminality, which could be done with being resolved as well. So yeah, I mean, I just don't think that there's a one size fits all point. But when we look at the sort of the effects of murder rates and capital punishment, we do seem to see that murder rates aren't really affected very heavily by capital punishment, because the punishments for murder are usually pretty severe in places like the United States already, where it would be life without parole versus murder, or like life in prison versus murder. Most of them don't believe they're going to get caught, and so that's the biggest sort of factor. The PSR seems so weird. How is that evidence when we have scientific evidence that not everything happens in a specific way for any reason? There is absolutely no scientific evidence for something to happen in a specific way for any reason. There is no evidence at all that implies absolute arbitrariness. In fact, that's non-scientific thinking. Like science is looking for determinate concrete proof of given explanations, such that even when you look into science, the methodology that you engage with from a scientific standpoint is essentially a search for truth. And if you undermine that search by saying some things happen for no reason at all, and you undermine the principle of sufficient reason in that respect, then you've basically undermined science, and there's nothing left. You're just left with like arbitrary justifications. There's nothing in order to imply that there was that anything has an explanation other than the fact that it does actually happen. You'll end up with a kind of mysticism that you would see that I spoke to Mario about in relation to the Islamic tradition, where it seemed to have rejected science in lieu of a sort of mystical view of God's made it possible, that God is actualizing specifically everything. So how does it happen? Well, God makes it possible. If you argue for brute facts, I don't see it having any other epistemological effect than to say things happen and we don't know why, so why bother knowing? Like, knowledge isn't really possible. Not to mention the fact that ultimately it undermines the logical principles you'd be applying to reality that allow you to determine things like cause and effect. So you're basically saying cause and effect isn't a thing. Yeah, I've not looked into it. Personally, I'm still against capital punishment for reasons of mercy, similar to yourself. I think there's a lot stronger arguments for it than people realize, though. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I do agree. I don't think that it's like, and I think that there's points in human history where I think capital punishment was probably necessary. Star Trek is a post-scarcity society. Communism wouldn't be accurate. I'd argue the Borg are more accurate for communists. I'd probably agree. Or fascism for that matter. I think that either way, it's a forced ideological conversion, such as it's kind of a noble lie. I think that's a noble lie of perfection. God does have to be all loving in order to be himself. I'd argue that in order for God to be one with himself, then he has to be the unification of all beings, such that his experience and the way that he relates to himself is a mode of care. And since he relates to himself through all being, and since we are sustained limitations of his being, he experiences what we experience. He knows what we know, to the point in which our very existence is our very existence that he sustains is an act of love for us. So it doesn't make sense for us to say that like God made us for himself, such that it is tied to his self-love. I'm not really familiar with that filthy centrist. I'd have to really look it up. So I can't really give you a response. I think somebody asked something about something similar before. I don't know if it was you or someone else, and I think I meant to look it up. I have a feeling I might have even had this sort of I remember seeing something similar to this in A-level philosophy, almost, in terms of the theories of cognitive development. Yeah, I think I have. I think that was A-level philosophy. Man, I don't know. I don't know. It's been a long time. What caused God? It's a mistake to ask what causes God, because God would be a necessary being, such that causation is explained in relation to God. You end up with essentially you end up with a contradiction, because God is essentially self-caused. That's how he's defined. So in other words, like, God has to be purely actual. Causation implies a relationship between potentiality and actuality, such that if there was something which caused God, he simply wouldn't be God. And the arguments, for example, the argument from sufficient reason is to imply that there must be a necessary first cause, and that necessary first cause must be simple and contain its own sufficient reason. Or the reason for its own existence. So a necessary being contains all of the reason for its own existence. It has to be. It's not something that is brought into existence. That would define the difference between a necessary being and a contingent being. And what Leibniz argues is that you can't establish the chain of not just causation, but sufficient reason for any object without presupposing the existence of a necessary being. And I agree. Have you made a video explaining your religious views? If not, are you planning on making one? Yeah, I'm absolutely planning on making one. Random guy. I did do a stream on it a while, like not too long ago, where I talked about an explanation of Hegel's consideration of the Trinity, which people seem to enjoy. But I need to sort of cut that out and upload it as a video for itself as well. What are your thoughts on the Federation being about 99% vegan? Oh yeah, the Federation's like pretty vegan, man. I love that. That's genuine moral progress. Love that. That's one thing I'll say is going to be in the future. The world will be vegan, man. Don't you think the centralization of AI is to be as powerful as people think? Could they enshrine a permanent bourgeois, those that control the technology? I think AI is actually not even. I mean, I see that as a threat. Like in some respects, I think it'll lead to more of a technocracy in that respect. But yeah, I could see it as having unfavorable effects economically, certainly, enshrining certain classes and maybe alienating people from powers that they would have had as economic actors. But I think, in terms of liberal capitalist economy, one door opens and another, one door closes, another opens. You'll probably find that obviously there'll be people who have to, like the decentralization of something like artificial intelligence will probably allow people to promote, to reduce businesses that were otherwise impossible. I want to say it's in my quote. Where was that? Oh, right, yeah. Produce businesses that weren't possible, also produce jobs that would have otherwise not existed. And also allow people to, without the same startup capital, engage in more developed business ventures, right? Because you won't need as many staff, you won't need as many. So when you're a big company, you can hire whoever you need to do all the jobs that you want done. When you're like a smaller startup, you don't have that kind of capital. So it could have, in some respects, a decentralizing effect in certain sectors. I don't think it's going to be, a predictable, like, okay, AI is going to increase centralization and worsen the economics that we already have. I think that mechanism is already ongoing secondarily to AI, such that the asset owning class is being propped up by the government, who are continually bailing them out, such that it is worsening the effects of capitalism. So we have almost a governmental acceptance and even a perpetuation of monopoly and conglomeration that's causing like massive problems. So I think AI, will lead to different economic shifts, but it won't necessarily alienate all the workers. But I mean, I think it's probably going to have a very similar effect to the exportation of the workforce that happened to Britain, right? You can, Britain in the Western society exported production to places like Asia, which generated a lot of wealth for a certain class in Britain, but ultimately corroded and degraded their economies, leading to a rise of Chinese wealth, which is leading to a challenge of global hegemony, ironically. So they've enriched themselves, but also managed to create political instability as the result. I could imagine something like that happening with AI. Um, I'm not sure how it's going to play out though, because economics is really, really complicated. There's a lot going on. Could a cyclical universe solve the problem the first caused without the need for a creator? No, not really, because you would just be saying that the cyclical universe would be a necessary being, but then I'll say that the necessary being implies certain attributes. And I would also argue that metaphysics can't be understood correctly without proposing a form of idealism. So a cyclical universe, in theory, could solve it, or you could argue for a different kind of necessary being. Some people argue for something like a quantum field or something like that. It wouldn't be like a cyclical universe because you have to have something outside of almost or atemporal, right? So that unifies cause and effect. So like a quantum field is usually proposed or something along those lines. But I don't think that it actually ends up working because what I would argue is that I'd argue for idealism, and essentially you'd have to be able to unify. It would be the unity of ideas and mind, such that it would be like what would end up describing as just God with different words. And that's what happens. It was a great debate I watched recently between Ed Fazer and Graham Oppy, who were basically Ed Fazer ended up pushing Graham Oppy to the point of saying, like at the point in which he's bottoming out, if he starts talking about like these brute facts, and he's talking about like particulars being brute facts, he's saying that in order to give an explanation for their existence, he's going to have to appeal to something else, which shows and explains that relation pluralistically, and at which point you're going to end up saying, well, there is a single unifying being or unifying essence. And Ed Fazer is just going to say, well, what you're describing in that unifying essence is God, such that the properties of that essence imply the divine attributes. So that you can't get away from sufficient reason. CTPLR. Hey, did you read anything by Albert Camus? I think his philosophy is pretty flawed. He essentially starts with a meaningless and absurd world that ends with the higher purpose anyway, the revolt. I mean, like, Albert Camus is responding really to a kind of nihilism, right? And I agree that his presuppositions are flawed, but I think what he's trying to do is kind of take that in the same way as Nietzsche, is take a kind of pro-life stance, in the sense that it's like life-affirming stance. Don't fall into the depths of depression. What does he say? I found in the depths of winter an eternal summer. And his idea is really it's almost Schopenhauerian on its head, right? Where it's very much like Nietzsche, I think, in the sense that it is that you will your own meaning to life. That the pursuit of meaning must never end and can never end, but you must enjoy the continued pursuit for meaning. I think it's nonsense, don't get me wrong, but at least he's happy, right? Like, it could be worse. He could be a nihilist. So I think that he's wrong because of his presuppositions, essentially to absurdity. Meaninglessness can't be ever shown to be the case because it essentially undermines itself. And so there must be a real meaning from which one can, in principle, identify. But yeah, I mean, I still think that at least he's happy, man. Like, it could be worse. I have not filthy centrist. You keep asking things I can't answer. I'm really sorry. Like, I feel bad. I would argue society's become more apathetic, not more welcoming. I think that we're having more and more problems in some respects, but I think that those problems are following a predictable linear course, such that it's dialectical, right? We're going one way and then the other, such that it seems that we regress away from certain truths. We progress away from let's say, one form of dogmatism to a kind of abstract hedonism, and then we fall from that abstract hedonism into another form of dogmatism, which is superior, and then try to work that through that abstract hedonism, through that dogmatism, it leads to unhappiness, it gets rejected, and then the cycle continues. And that's basically what Hegel says is happening. It's universalism versus particularism in one respect, or particularity and universality, such that an empty universalism, he sees a lot of abstract religious dogma as empty universalism, such that people just needlessly restrain themselves and lead to unhappy lives, which leads to a rejection of the eventual frustration and rejection of religion. Once religion's rejected, people fall into hedonism. The hedonistic life is meaningless and purposeless, such that they can't define why they want anything, what is good for them, and then so seek to define meaning in their lives, and so turn to religion again. But the problem is that they often don't want to take responsibility for themselves, so they don't engage in philosophy. They just they turn to an abstract religious ritualism, and basically give the conception of the good life away to the papal or the priestial authority. That doesn't work because they can't accurately represent. Even when they try, they cannot perfectly represent the interests of all individuals unless they willfully, rationally engage. So they fall into hedonism again. And he's saying that basically the ignorance of the people is leading us from one way to the other, but it is a cycle in which we are overcoming that ignorance, stepping more and more towards something better. What do you think about Protestants? Also, what led you to Catholicism specifically, and what criticisms do you have of non-Catholics? I mean, I like Protestants. Like, I think there's a lot of interest in Protestant thinkers. I'm not going to say all Protestants are bad. I think Protestantism is too individualistic. I think that the rejection of a unified universal church leads to usually arbitrary, abstract readings of scripture, and they just end up reading whatever they want into the Bible, which is why you get Protestants in the United States who seem to be incredibly conservative, literal fundamentalist Christians reading the Bible in the dumbest way possible, and then you get people who are saying Jesus is trans and clearly just sort of reading whatever ideological, what will benefit them ideologically into the Bible. And it seems that they aren't able to communicate and criticize each other's interpretations of scripture in an intelligible way, such that they create a dogma and a doctrine which has progressed and develops over time. So you end up with essentially meaningless feeling and a lack of solidified reason. Now, that's not to say that Protestants are all incapable of reasoning, because I don't believe that. But that the institution of the church is important. Now, that varies from Protestant sects, right? Like, so the Anglicans are going to be more like unified, for example, than your sort of typical, like I don't know, your sort of American Baptists and stuff. And your various sects in America. And it depends on how they even understand things like revelation, right? Like, what is revelation? How does it work? Some people think it's just feeling, right? So I think there's a lot of problems in Protestantism. I think the rejection of the church led to a lot of downfalls. I also think Protestantism was probably a necessary step. I think that there was a lot of corruption in the church that needed to be brought to light, that needed to be essentially chastised and rebelled against. But at the same time, the way that the Protestants did it led to problems in Western Europe and a lot of severe dogmatism in terms of religious structures, and sort of abstract moral thinking, which ends up alienating people and causing this sort of societal degradation where people reject ethical limitation and ethical institutions and try to just seek their own personal goods separate from any sort of unified body of the church. And I mean, that's very much tied into, I would argue, that the Protestant reformers were particularly nominalist, that those nominalists were, that nominalism leads to an egoistic ethic, that egoism leads to a liberalism in terms of how we engage with one another, and that the interpretation of liberalism leads to such a the individualism that's necessarily implicit leads to radical at least two varied interpretations of egoistic rights-based approaches from the liberal doctrine, and you end up with competing rationalities which are essentially incommensurable and could only be resolved if they resolve the metaphysical issue and the differences between agents with a kind of empathy which you would see within a unifying principle, which is essentially the church. So that I also think that the way in which fundamentalism is absolutely insane. I don't think that it's even a legitimate form of interpretation. I think that the symbolic relation between them and Christ is lacking metaphysical reality because they've turned the Eucharist into a kind of nominal essence such that they're forever alienated from God, usually. It increases politicization in the church, such that the church is brought more into specific state-related politics. And I think you see that even in the Orthodox traditions as well. And there's no real doctrine, like metaphysical doctrine, which is shared and understood. And it also encourages private readings of scripture such that the meaning is their own and can't be chastised or called into question. So yeah, I don't think any of it makes sense, really. I'm not a fan of Protestantism, but I think there's a lot of interesting and good Protestant thinkers who enhance the Christian tradition. But Protestantism itself, I don't think has been largely successful. PP, not absolute arbitrariness, but outcomes are not predetermined, and there is no reason that they would happen one way or the other. I think it would be absolutely arbitrary if you're saying that if you reason from consequences to essentially causes, and then you find that the chain of causation has no explanation, as in completely indeterminate, then it'll essentially collapse into arbitrariness. And I don't even think that it makes sense. And you can try and say that this is compatible with quantum physics. I don't think it is. I don't think that this is what quantum physics is explicating. It's not saying that there is a random bedrock from which explains determinate reality. Because the only reason that you're able to even argue for that is to presuppose that there is a determinate foundation for reality, which you are seeking. And then you find a kind of indeterminism. And that indeterminism seems to necessarily collapse into a determinate reality, which has structures of meaning which are necessary and universal, not indeterminate. So I would argue the exact opposite. I think that what we see from physics is a determinate structure, not an indeterminate one. And that indeterminism might be part of reality, sure, but not absolute indeterminism such that it structures and gives meaning to reality, or that the meaning of reality is structured from an indeterminate source. I don't think that's coherent. Damn, what happened? Were you a Catholic for the whole time? No, I reverted back to Catholicism about 2 years ago. I'm trying. Where am I? Okay. Before you became a Christian, were you an atheist? I was an agnostic. So I argued literally from like agnostos, like lack of knowledge. You can't know that you would from that position, and I argued for that position because really, I was sort of disillusioned that we could have knowledge of a perfectly conceivable being, and I thought we could only talk about him from a point of analogy, which implied that I couldn't have direct knowledge of God and that I could only have knowledge of what God wasn't. And so, how could I know that God exists or not if all I can know is that what isn't God? But then I can't know that God doesn't exist either, since the negative implies the positive and vice versa. So, agnostic. Those seemed like the rational position. I've changed my position since then, since I believe that you can have knowledge of God, and I think we must even have knowledge of God. But it wasn't until I read Hegel's Science of Logic that I realized that was the case. But not. But I wasn't ever atheist. I've never thought the atheist position is at all remotely convincing. In fact, I think it is the least convincing of all positions. Not all positions, obviously, but like of between theism, agnosticism, and atheism, I think atheism has the least evidence for it. Where agnosticism, the arguments for agnosticism and the arguments for theism are stronger. I haven't read Fezer's book, An Intro to Scholastic Metaphysics. That sounds a good idea, actually, though. I don't think it is defining love into existence, Miss K, if you're talking about the love of the Trinity, because the love of the Trinity is the unity between the Father and the Son, such it is the unity of the self and self-interest, such that the will of a single being can be made whole and understood. It's essentially self-love and the love of the other is the same thing in love, and it's the unifying force that connects. It's you could think about this in terms of even like how desire necessarily relates to our capacity for knowledge, such that knowing oneself and loving oneself are necessarily the same thing. Infinite regress. I don't think an infinite regress is possible. I think it leads to an absence of a first cause, and so an absence of causation or an explanation of causation. I would argue if God exists, that both love and hatred must be contained within it. I don't think that is coherent. I think that what is to be understood as hatred would be a form of destruction and rejection, such that God would have to reject his own existence, or his own, would have to reject his own existence. I don't think that would make sense. I would say hatred is just an incoherent stance in the first place, which is why the Christian position rejects it. So, in terms of, I think Martin Luther. You don't think Martin Luther was a nominalist? I think Martin Luther was a nominalist. I'm pretty sure he even directly. I want to say Luther actually specifically. I want to say that he actually. I'm sure that he said that he followed William of Ockham, or even said that he was influenced by William of Ockham, which led to like the whole like sola scriptura. I'm not sure about Calvin actually. I was thinking about needing to read Calvin again today anyway, just in relation to his arguments from predestination. It's kind of weird that he brought him up. Um, uh, 1 second. I need to let the dog out. I'm gonna take this opportunity to grab a drink, guys, as well. So just keep dropping your questions. I'll be right back. Hello. There we go. Okay. Right. Where was I? Right. Where are we? All right. Outcomes and measurements of specific entangled particle spins occur in a certain way without any specific predetermined reason. I cannot understand how you reconcile with this PSR. Well, actually, what you're telling me is that the specific categories of reason and logical modes of being, which when interrelate, entangle and produce macroscopic effects which are determinate and understandable. And until that happens, nothing is to be understood. But what we can know is that the very bedrock exists a fabric of reality which exhibits logical, determinate structures, right? That interrelate and structure the whole, such that the whole structures the indeterminacy and the determinacy structures the whole, right? So that's just what Hegel would say is like a relationship between in the same thing as universality and particularity, such that absolute particularity would be nothingness, doesn't happen. The next step from that would be quantum, which would be like the smallest measurable qualities of existence. They would be categorical relations, and what you're saying is you're putting them in merely physical terms. I don't think it's necessarily the best way to do it, but even in purely physical terms, you're saying that there are physical categories of existence which give meaning to certain aspects of existence, to the foundational bedrock of existence, such that it's not purely arbitrary. It has a definite, determined structure which gives it, where you can say that it's spinning at a certain speed, or that it's in a certain location, or or like at a certain frequency in terms of like wavelength or whatever. At whatever point you want to say this, how this works. So I don't know how this is purely indeterminate and arbitrary. It doesn't seem to be. And it's not even. It doesn't seem to be contrary to the principle of sufficient reason at all. It seems to presuppose the principle of sufficient reason, such that you only know about it because we can give a sufficient reason for its existence. Council communism. Council communist commitments argue that society and economy should be managed by coordinations of worker councils made up of delegates elected at workplaces and can be called kind of like anarcho syndicalism in many ways, or like a syndicalist version of reality. I think that I don't know. I don't think. I think one, you can't rely upon merely worker order democracy. I don't think that would work. I think that there needs to be a broader democratic structure, which essentially represents the interests of people despite the specific interests of various factions in society. Which would, I mean, these workplaces would just be political factions in the same way as families, tribes, villages, things like that. So I just think that what we're talking about is trying to increase democratization, and I think that's a good thing. I think that decentralization of democracy only goes so far. And I think we can see a great example of that is the United States, where certain states and certain states want to even democratically express an unjust ethic, and they have to be reeled in by their peers. So by all then you would just have to presuppose that these councils, then you'd have a council of councils, and then you'll have a council of council of councils, and you're just going to get structures of government. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying it's got no merit, but I would have to look into it more. I like the idea of opposing a revolutionary party seizing power. I'll certainly say that. Because it does, I think you're right, it does end up in a party dictatorship, always, every time. fascism. Why do you think you still haven't secured a live stream of 1K viewers, and why are you proceeding anyway? Well, I don't really think that 1,000 viewers at a time is the metric of success. I don't know if you've actually seen live streamers. That's quite a hefty number. And I've only really just gotten back to doing it. I mean, I've had over 180 to 300 viewers when I was doing it regularly. And I'm hoping to build my numbers back up, but it's about essentially having a mediated, well thought out content strategy. And right now I'm all in on streaming, and I need to bring back some of the structured, sort of structured, pre-planned content in order to drive traffic and so on. But like, yeah, like live streaming's not just like, it's, to be honest, it's you got to work at it, man. It's not something that happens overnight. So why do I keep doing it, man? Like, why do you go to job? Why do you go to work in the morning, right? Like, you know, like, you know, like it's, you know, you've got to have that kind of entrepreneurship where you hope that you're going to get something good out of it at the end, and you invest your time and your energy and you work at it. And if you're unsuccessful, you're unsuccessful, but at least you can live with yourself and say you tried, right? Because otherwise, what do you just doom yourself to like employeeship or something? What do you think of writers such as Yuval Noah Harari? Harari? I'm currently reading his third edition of Sapiens, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He speculates on all of this. I'll have to check it out. I mean, I was supposed to read Sapiens. I remember someone recommending Sapiens. Definitely have to give Sapiens a go. I think it's interesting. I think the more thinkers we'll have chiming in, it's a good thing. I think universal basic income is probably going to be a necessity in order for our economy to function, primarily because asset owning is becoming increasingly alienated to the point in which if we don't get given money to survive, then there won't be any money for us to essentially have, because asset ownership is producing wealth to the point in which it alienates the mass majority of individuals, and it's not being made up for by essentially employeeship. So yeah, I think probably going to end up needing it. I don't think it's a solution, and I don't think it's a good thing in and of itself. I believe in a welfare state and having protections for individuals and universal benefits and stuff. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's bad because universal benefit or whatever like that. I'm saying it's bad because of what it's mediating is probably an unsustainable, unjust structure in itself. It's not a bad, it's a medication. Like, we're medicating the patient rather than curing the disease, right? Like we're sort of we're relieving symptoms rather than fixing the problem, I think. I don't think rigid price controls work, and I don't think putting homeless people and landlords in prison would for causing homelessness would work either. I don't think it would even be just. I don't think landlords are the responsible for homelessness individually. I think a lot of them are looking to just protect their assets in some respects. I don't think they're bad people. I think that we haven't taken steps to limit landlord ownership of these assets. So we can't necessarily blame them for accumulating more assets when we haven't intervened. I wouldn't blame that class. I don't think it's their fault. I think that the government's not representing the interests of the many, but of the few. I think that there are many measures that we could put in place, and I think without landlords, we need landlords right now. Like, getting rid of landlords overnight would be drastic. I think what we need is a clever mediated strategy which reduces landlord ownership of private accommodation through clever forms of taxation rather than just And rigid price controls are not going to help either. I think that what you'll have is a market which will become volatile. Landlords will essentially go out of business, and you'll have a mass exodus of landlords. The property market will crash, but there'll be no one who has the capital to buy them. So you'll have empty homes and homelessness simultaneously. It's not one way or the other. Philosophy, yeah, man. I don't want landlords to supply the capital and not get a return. That's not what I want. I want limited landlord ownership. So I don't think there's a problem with someone owning one, two, three, four even houses, whatever. I don't really care. I start having a problem when someone owns 150 homes, and is simultaneously raising the prices in the market because, like, in terms of how they price up their homes, and then how they interact with other huge um, asset owners, um, essentially worsens the problem. Not only that, they levy the assets to gain more assets, such that they gain liquid capital and buy assets. So you buy a home, you rent it out, you use the assets from that home to buy another home, you rent it out. And not only that, but you can take, like, depending upon the way in which lenders will lend you more money, and like they'll lend you specific, depending on certain rates, such that you can essentially, so you'll take a mortgage out on, your home, and then you can use that to essentially, like, I was watching a finance video talking about how to essentially make more, how to get liquid capital whilst buying up properties. It's pretty wild. Like, it's essentially like a way of leveraging different mortgage types, from what I understand of it. If you provide capital at a market rate rather than buy up limited supply of a commodity, then rents seek from that artificially scarce resource different things, but capital pushing for securing advantage for furthering capital advantage is a built-in function of capitalism. I mean, yeah, I do think there's a problem with capitalism in general that needs to be mediated. But I don't think that we can just turn off capitalism overnight. I think that would be, a problem. So I think that what we'll have to do is seek to represent the interests more and more of the party that's being alienated from asset ownership. And the way to do that is to increase the amount of, to lower the prices of assets, but also increase the amount of, essentially wealth that ends up in their hands. And right now we're seeing the exact opposite. Wages are dropping, inequality is worsening, whilst also the asset owning class has become richer and richer. And I think that inequality is going to cause problems in our society. And yeah, largely big corporations. I think we need to just look at, like, how even the top 1% has become squeezed by the top 0.1% in terms of asset ownership. The top 10% is squeezed by the top 1%, and the top 1% is now even getting squeezed by the top 0.1%. And what we're seeing is the death of the middle class in the UK. And that's a problem. That's definitely a problem. And then the Social Democrats' solution is just to tax the middle class. So you tax the middle class, even though it's the middle class who are suffering, and you use them to pay for the lower classes. And obviously, that's not going to fully function for long. How do you resolve panentheism with divine simplicity? How do you hold both positions simultaneously? God has no parts. Because we aren't a part of God. God's essence isn't defined in relation to us. We're defined in relation to Him. So I wouldn't say that, although we share the same being, such that we are limited beings of that being, we don't define His existence, He defines ours, such that our contingent reasons are defined within the necessary reason that of his existence. If you think of him being absolutely universal, such that he is universality defined in relation to himself, if you were to wipe us out, like the universe out, nothing would change for God, because he's the set of sets. The only thing that would change would be for us. So it's our relationship to God is one in which we understand ourselves as having a real definitive relationship to God, while God's relationship to us is virtual, such that he can essentially eliminate us at any time. Does God then contain himself? Yes, God contains himself. Have I been raided by Chud Logic? I just realized I'm a fucking idiot. Oh, thank you so much, Chud Logic. I'm a fucking idiot. I've just been like sort of like plowing on this whole time. Man, Chud Logic, you're a fucking lad. Absolutely class. Really appreciate it. Like, I'm such a fucking idiot. I don't know how I'm just been totally like fucking out of it, man. Like, thank you so much. What a gent. I would have to, man. I feel actually embarrassed. I feel like such an ingrate now. I'm such a dickhead. Oh man, nah. But thank you so much, Chud, man. Really appreciate it. That's some British unity there. You know, he's representing the people, man. What a good lad. Have you read Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy? I have. What about them? Blood sacrifice is retribution. Okay. We're going to probably... Which one of you in YouTube chat wants to sacrifice yourself to Twitch? I don't know. I don't make the rules, man. It's the way it has to be. Max? You seem like... It's got to probably... I'm thinking Max at a recorder. Okay. I've just got back to where I was. Civilization would be better off without the existence of the right wing and the left wing. They are both threats to civilization. Well, I mean, actually, there is a point to be made there in the sense that, like, what they represent is political extremes. I don't think that you can just poof your way out of political extremes, right? And the reason they exist is really is what I would take to be dialectical, that they represent the extremes of thought of the reason which defines the age. But I don't think that that the way that we engage in two-party politics is to define these like incompatible, incommensurate differences rather than the unified whole is healthy. And I think that you can see that in the French Assembly where this language came from, the left wing and the right wing. That just led to everyone murdering each other. So I think that, you know, you're right in one respect. Like, it's clearly a bad way of approaching things if you like get so locked into like who's left wing, who's right wing. You know, then you just end up trying to kill each other. You know, one side's paranoid you're gonna try and kill them, and this like right now, like on Twitter, everyone's like civil war. It's like if you have a civil war, it'll be because you are sat there predicting and sort of betting on having a civil war. It's like it's so wild. Chud's chat doesn't like people called Max. Well, there we go. That's actually, so this is an SE dynamite. So this is it's like supposed to look like a dynamite stick, but for whatever reason it's like a cloud lifter. So this has been a dynamic mic. Essentially can't, like, if I was to take this out, you wouldn't be able to hear me. This adds like 20 points of gain without essentially corrupting the signal. So like a little boost. It's like a signal booster really. So then the thing is I wanted to put it at the other side into my audio interface, and it just, for whatever reason, it won't work, and I can't work out why, because nothing should actually change. When you do it, it adds this horrible line, like what, like, and it hasn't got a battery in it, but it's powered by phantom power. Yeah, nobles versus peasants, Catholics and Protestants. Yeah, it seems to be like there is always this like dichotomy that keeps arising, man. Like it does. It's not something that you can kind of just get out, you know, like just remove from society. So I agree. It's gonna constantly happen. The only civil war in Texas would be over the choice of tea. We want red bush. None of that black tea. Oh God. Imagine choosing red bush tea over black tea. Oh, that's sickening in itself. Yeah, that's what I thought as well. You'd think it'd be the same at either side, and and I don't know why. I have absolutely no idea why. And to be honest, I'm not actually happy with this being here because I'm kind of worried it puts stress and tension on the mic, and I don't want it to break the mic because this is much cheaper than this. So the plan is really to just swap it out, like either get another XLR cable and just put it in between, or swap it out for a cloud lifter. You know, I'd be so mad if America has a civil war. Like, I actually would be. Like, I'd be so fucking mad if America has a civil war. If like the one time we fucking actually need you to be the military badasses they're supposed to be, and then they start just fighting each other, it would be just fucking typical. It would just that I think it would be just so frustrating. It's like, all right, all of this big talk about being like the global hegemon, you know, the military superpower, like ready to fight anyone, and then they just start fighting each other because they can't wait a little while. It's like, man, just give it some time. I'm sure you'll have your opportunity. Just fucking please. Yeah, I mean, I did actually look into like audio because I realized that audio needs to be like at least of an okay quality. And my audio was really bad at one point in some of my videos. It was just so bad, and I just deep dived into it. Non-duality have a Christian counterpart by Douglas Harding who had an experience of headlessness. Does that ring a bell? No, it does not, I'm afraid. Civilization would be better off. Oh, I've read that one. How do you justify the consumption of meat and animal products in the Bible and its acceptance by the Pope? Um, I think really just a temporal thing. I mean, you know, I'm going to argue for animal liberation, right? Like I'm a vegan. I think that it's just a matter of progression and an understanding of the concept of love, which is progressing within the Christian tradition. Um, but I, you know, find out when I've got the PhD written, and I'll have all the different avenues covered by then. Oh, Mario, you're on Twitch now. Check you out. Check you out, Mario. If hell is real, what do you think it's like? I think hell would necessarily be different to everyone because it being the frustration of the wicked will would be an imposition of the most frustration you can impose upon yourself. So the more you want, the more frustrated you'll get, such that the sin which is leading you to hell would define your existence in hell. That's what I think hell would be like. Are there any plants that are immoral to eat similar to animals? I mean, I've never really seen any sentient plants, man. I know that people like there was like someone made a video was like recently like plants talking to each other, but it just seems to be like responses again. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of for any kinds of plants that are conscious. So I would say no. Yeah, he was influenced by Occama. That does mean he's a nominalist. I'll double check, but I'm pretty sure that he affirms quite a lot of nominalism in terms of his scripture scriptural interpretation. Lewis. Does being a Catholic impact much of your day to day emotionally? Like, how do you relate to friends? I feel like being a Catholic, since I became a Catholic, has leveled us out a little bit more in terms of just me relation to myself. Um, you know, I have I don't know, like I feel like you know, you have faith and you have trust in God in this respect. So it helps sort of psychologically. It's sort of psychologically protective. But ultimately, there's not like a massive change where I'm like, wow. The biggest change is mostly how I relate to others and myself in a sort of in a way. But I was already a moral realist before I was a Catholic, right? So, and a vegan. So I think the biggest difference is I think it sort of makes it more like moral realism more apparent and more like sort of present. And I think the act of prayer is a meditative act that forces you to contemplate your relationship to yourself and others. Did you know that Catholics eat turtles? Do you do that? I don't eat turtles. I must not be a Catholic. What's the opposite of nominalism, and why do you think nominalism? And do you think nominalism is wrong? The opposite of nominalism, nominalism really is defined by this idea of a nominal essence, so that the only thing that exists is the sort of particulars that you achieve a posteriori, that you conceive of a posteriori. So the typically the way in which nominalism is engaged. Not all forms of nominalism are like that, but I think that's the dominant form of nominalism. So there aren't any unified universals that exist. Instead, only particulars exist. And I think the inverse of that would likely be something like Gnosticism, like Platonism, and then to the nth degree Gnosticism, such that this is a world of death and fiction, and this is untruth and falsity, whilst the world beyond is truth. Very sort of one's very hyper leads to a kind of hyper individualistic, egoistic ethic, very related to the world you're in, and the specific desires you have, and trying to understand the world you're in, but not very well, because you end up detaching yourself away from the world you're in a kind of weird psychological sense. And the other one is essentially detached, abstract universalism. So, like, kind of abstract particularity versus abstract universalism. But obviously, it depends upon your nominalist, and that would be a kind of exaggerated conceptual realism. I've never seen Catholics eat turtles, man. I'll have to look into this. Is there actually like people eating Catholics? That's not cool, man. I would say that they're wrong for eating Catholics. But I'm going on to a PhD basically arguing that Catholics should be vegan, right? So, don't blame me. Why Catholicism and not other denominations? So I'd say that I think Catholicism has the superior institutional structure, metaphysical foundations, and philosophy, and doctrinal approaches. Right. So, I'm very much in favor of the Philosopher in terms of interpreting the Trinity. I think that's the best conception of the Trinity. I think that the Orthodox conception of the Trinity is not as good. I think that when you say like Protestantism, there's no like one kind of Protestantism, but I don't usually like the metaphysics in Protestantism, and I certainly don't like the lack of unity in the church. I think that we need a kind of universality there, and that's implied by a universal human nature, or a common universal nature, which we're engaged in together as rational agents, such that we discover ourselves in the other, rather than. And I also reject sola scriptura. I think that's absolute nonsense. So I think hermeneutically, Catholicism's the best. But I think Orthodoxy applies the same sort of thing. I think metaphysically, Catholicism outcompetes Orthodoxy because of its understanding of the Trinity. And I think even politically, it's superior because of the universality of the church, and even its lack of sort of political allegiances, such that you get like national churches. I fucking hate national churches. I think that's weird. Such that the church is being defined by the nation state. Oh, that's sickening. One thing having a diocese, man. As that, I'm happy. Dioceses are fine, but national churches, that's weird. I don't like that. Have you actually read anything on Catholic dogma or simple article, dude? I'm not gonna lie, I've never heard of Catholics eating like maybe I'm totally ignorant, but I've never heard of Catholics eating turtles. That one's new to us. That's totally new to us. I don't know what to say. Oh, is this when people are basically just eating fish? Like they use stuff trying to find like essentially animals that they don't consider meat to eat during an absence of like every Catholic around here just eats fish. So I don't know what to tell you. Uh, but I've never seen Catholics don't have to eat turtles during Lent, and I didn't even know there was a trend of Catholics eating turtles. It's because they're cold-blooded reptiles. Catholics are the reason that the fish and chip shop is busy on the Friday. It must be stopped. Absolutely, that's it. That is it. Like that was a lot of my childhood. It's just like technically this is not meat, and that's a very Catholic approach to essentially rules in general, which is to find the we're technically obeying. Like that's a very Catholic approach to rules. Like the Protestants would see we're in hell for that 100%. I love turtles too, man. They shouldn't be eating them. Um, what happens to those people who existed 100 or perhaps 200,000 years before Jesus and even the other prophets arrived, where heaven looked down with complete indifference? I don't think heaven looked down with complete indifference. And also, let's be honest, like the biblical, like how you understand scripture isn't, I don't think should be taken as necessarily like a historical approach to how the world works, but rather an exposition of metaphysical and ethical doctrine. And in which case, like it applies just as much to them as it does to all of the people who are around at the time of Moses or Jesus or any of the prophets. You know, it doesn't make a difference. And that's where you get like even from like Christian interpretations of the hallowing of hell, right? Turtles are up there for sure, yeah, man. Yeah, indifference isn't since Jesus. Yeah, 100% shadow. Jesus descended into hell. That's the how. Yeah, you do have that right. I completely agree. I'm pretty sure I actually said something. I have like a. I want to say like I might have even said something. Grab something. I want to say that. That's something. It might have been last. I want to say that I want to say that there was something written in it recently in my local church bulletin, specifically on it, but I'll have to hunt it out. I don't know where I've put it. No, I don't know where I've put it. I lose all of these things. How am I presupposing something that has no evidence, Aaron, in terms of the principle of sufficient reason? Like the idea is to say that, like, in order to have evidence at all, Aaron, you have to have sufficient reason. You have to presuppose that something has sufficient reason for its existence. Otherwise, you'd say it's arbitrary. Like, do you not understand? Like, it's like in order for me to say like the evidence that there is a glass bottle on the table is the presence of this glass bottle on the table, right? For me to even be able to prove the hypothesis or even probabilistically reason from a Bayesian scenario, such that I can gain like maybe even epistemological confidence one way or the other, I already have to presuppose that there is a sufficient explanation, and that explanation is a sufficient reason for something's existence. Does that make sense? We can discuss it at some point, Aaron. Why do I care about anything? I don't think that you can choose not to care. I don't think that's actually a coherent stance. I don't think you can actually like totally not care about anything. You can limit your cares and your relation to the world, but I think what you're describing is, I think it. You know, you may be trying. I don't even think an ego death would do the job. What's my views on the doctrine of papal infallibility? Well, I interpret papal infallibility to be an infallible expression of the truth of the Catholic position at a given time, um, such that it unites the faith, such that the truths must be preserved by the next pope, but that it does not exhaust the truth, and the interpretation of the doctrine and scripture is not exhausted by any given generation or any given papal, um, uh, any given pope, but is exhausted by papal authority itself. What's your view on homosexuality? I'm very progressive with homosexuality in terms of how I think that homosexual marriage should be allowed in the Catholic Church. Um, I gave it. I've got a video on it recently. I talked about it on my channel on YouTube. I will not be live streaming me wedding, Maximo. Definitely not. Sorry to ask again, but do you think that the artificial insemination of animals is comparable to rape? I think it is. I don't think it's necessarily as psychologically impactful. But I do think that it is a kind of rape. I just don't think that that an animal relates to that body in the same way as a human relates to its body, so that the psychological effects aren't as necessarily bad for the animal. It's not to say that it's not rape and the exploitation of an animal's sexual organs for the benefit of another, but rather that it just simply doesn't have the same psychological damage as it would to humans. Physical damage and emotional damage down the line, yeah, sure. And even psychological distress in the moment, but not in the way that it would traumatize a human because of the way in which we relate to ourselves in terms of identity. Um, all this, all of this is, uh, all of this, meaning the discussion of AI and states of fascism, communism, liberalism into the future. At the beginning, though, I've been given alternatives here, which is nice. Doesn't make one sense. Wasango was go PP. I'm not sure what that means, man. Um, I don't think sodomy is, well, I think sodomy is a sin in the sense that I think there was the sin of Sodom, but I think the sin of Sodom is more likely inhospitality, and the it has more to do with raping angels, man. If you read the story of Sodom, right, it's not that they're having gay sex in a loving relationship. The sin of Sodom is that they are cooking children, they are birthing children to eat them, and they are willing to essentially rape and kill, like such that two angels pop into the society and their instant thought is, I want to rape and kill these angels, right? Like, or at least rape these angels, right? Like that seems to me the sin of Sodom is rape more than anything, and specifically a kind of this and even it's the pure rejection and use of another seems to be the sin of Sodom, not a loving relationship between two homosexual men. Um, But dogmatism and bad press essentially got the gays the blame for Sodom. Um, I'm looking to understand philosophical terminology. Is there an end to all the terms and opposing ideas necessary for getting a picture of a broader horizon of concepts? Um, yeah, I mean, you can. It's there's variations. There's various sources of where you can find an exposition of the terminology. Um, for example, nominalism versus Platonism, realism versus anti-realism. In terms of ballpark numbers, are we talking hundreds or thousands? In terms of essentially just being able to how many different definitions there are. I don't. I think that's actually. I think we'll largely mean the same thing when we talk about these terms, especially things like Platonism, right, which are defined by essentially an adherence to Platonic doctrine. Or something like nominalism. It's defined by specific thinkers, which we would title nominalist, usually spanning from William of Ockham and the problem and Boethius's problem of universal. So all of these things can be defined. It's just what you're looking to define might take or understand might take you, like, even if you get a definition of the word, like a mere definition's not going to suffice to give you the contents and exposition necessary to understand the concept behind the word, right? um yeah, surely cows have got to have humans put their form into their anus. Now the anus is pretty inhospitable, or did they just make up the story to dissuade people from switching the rhythm method to bum fun? Wait, what? um I don't think that the Sodom. I get it. Okay. Um, I don't think it's just. I think it's meant to be an expression of the greatest sin and how it falls into its own self destruction. Um, I bought my daughter the Anti-Oedipus and she's struggling. What is she struggling with? Our mental health after trying to read it. My God, the Anti-Oedipus is something, man. The Anti-Oedipus is rough, man. It's like a rough book. Like that's some pretty difficult philosophy though, like in general. So I'm not surprised. I told her to just read it. That's not the best way. That's certainly not the best way. I mean, like, you could do her a favor and just like get her a reader's guide or something, man. Like, just read it. Kind of random, but would you have any insight into Hegel's claim that music is the most subjective of the arts? Um, he talks about this quite a lot, actually. Wait, I'm trying to think of where he really, because it's on the point of religion as well. I want to say that from Hegel's position, that sound in general expresses a, because he even relates this to like birdsong, from what I'm aware, in the philosophy of nature, where it's the strict enjoyment of the self, and so it's the exposition of the self outward, and it's a rejection of what is in order to express a kind of the sort of the soul, if you will, um, such that it expresses the subject's enjoyment of the self in terms of birdsong. But specifically in terms of music, I'm gonna have to go and double check. You've got us to. Like the last thing I ever look into is Hegel on art. Not because Hegel's aesthetics isn't interesting. It's just because it's not what I do more than anything. think I want to say that because music is an expression of emotion, or rather, music is an expression of like a of subjectivity that is non-spatial. Um, it represents the relationship the individual has to themselves as a subject, not defined by the object, and that's why you would say it's not.
Nadia Yvette Chambers super chatted £7.87. The USA is headed towards Holocaust, not civil war. The right owns the military, police and all private arms and will impose Rouse's Rushduni-style theocracy, and the left has no ability to defend itself.
Thank you very much for the donation. I really hope you're wrong. I don't know if I would. I'm not so sure. I think that the right don't own as much as you think. I think there's a lot of conservatives on the right, but I think that the higher up command are more sympathetic to the Dems in terms of the generals, and the soldiers follow the chain of command. There's variations in terms of the military structure, in terms of how they vote. Like, so being a vet is more likely to get you to vote like Republican, don't get us wrong. But it depends on what branch of the military you're in. For example, things like military intelligence, things like that, vote differently. And there are liberal troops, such that it would cause there would be fighting. There certainly would be fighting, and civilian armies win wars, even if professional armies start them. The right don't own anything as well, with the idea that the people who own the military right now, or control the military right now, are the government, who aren't necessarily conservative, right? Like, you know, so will the military follow orders? I think the top commanders would, if it was for the good of the state. The lower levels, I think they'll have some problems, but I think that the unity of the United States will fall. Like, I think the United States will fall into line. Like, the individual soldiers will fall into line. I think that, like, you might see certain states cede, and that's where the civil war would commence. If like Texas and stuff is like, hey, we're not taking this governmental, like, federal restriction, and then the ceded. If they try to cede, then there would be a civil war. But I'm not sure if that's true. But thank you again for the donation. I really appreciate it. Helps the channel. I would not consider myself a Marxist. Not at all. Not even a little bit. Where am I? Definitions usually make sense learning a bit about them, but there's so many. Yeah, and that's because it's in relation to, like, you want to know what the definition refers to, and then look at the body of thought. That's the best way to know if the definition's right or not. The only versal that exists is the category of name for them, lad, basically. I completely disagree. I think but that is, oh, are you seeing that's the expression of nominalism? Like, what is nominalism? Yeah, that's nominalism. If philosophy has your name in front of Ian, then you're clearly a Don. I'm not sure if I'm understanding that. Is beauty transcendent? Oh, like, you mean like Hegelian or like Marxian or like whatever it would? Yeah, that's right. It's true. You're a big boy then. Is beauty transcendental for Hegel? I wouldn't say beauty's actually, yeah, probably. I mean, in some respects, I'd say beauty is the expression of in many ways is the unity of the subject with the object, such that it forms the basis of truth in many ways, such that the beautiful and the true are necessarily connected. So in one respect, yes, because it reflects how the subject relates to truth, such that it sort of finds itself in the enjoyment of truth, of its own truth. Like an enjoyment of the idea. Why should I become vegan? Because the consideration of what is right and good requires the recognition of all animal desires. I'd go so far as to say you can only properly recognize yourself if you recognize the value of other animals. We have empty homes and homelessness simultaneously now. True. More so in the United States, though, than the UK. That's a bigger problem for you guys. Hiya, Marshall. Nice to see you here. What do you think of the Protestants like Gavin Otland who say the church is like a general Christian community, but they have different churches and practices? I don't like the idea. I mean, in many ways, I think it mixes the idea of like a kind of nominal essence, such that there is no one way to be a Christian, such that like that you can be any form of Christian and still be, even though you have contrary beliefs, you could be under the same bracket. It's an empty signifier. It means nothing then. How do you justify being a socialist where it's basically considered equivalent to flat earth theory in economics? Well, I mean, I would argue for a kind of market socialism, like John Roma, for one. I wouldn't call myself a socialist in the same sense as like communist or something like that. And in terms of economics, I don't think that socialism is, depending on how you understand it, is seen as like flat earth theory at all. I think that there are competing theories of socialism. There's competing definitions for the word socialism, such that some theories of economics would have the United States as a socialist nation, right? And see a mixed economy as a necessarily socialist endeavor. So, like Austrians, for example, what really defines the differences between capitalism and socialism in terms of economics is largely levels of governmental or sort of state interference or sort of legislative power and interfering in free market laissez-faire economics. For the Marxists, they're going to say it's worker control versus sort of class ownership, right? Like, who owns the means of production. But I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to approach it. And I think ultimately what really defines the differences between socialism, which pre-existed Marxism, is the relationship between the market to the state, such that the socialists would put the market as an expression of private interests, but not exhaustive of the goods of the state, where the capitalist would say that a free market is necessary for the expression of the goods of the state and for liberty. So, yeah, like that's really the sort of big difference, I'd say. I don't think it's like a clean cut, right? Certainly don't think it's like flat earth theory. That's very, very exaggerated. I think more and more than egoism just represents a form of abject nihilism, the way Fichte would think about it as a rejection of the foundations of experience. I would agree, Sean. I think that seems about right in the sense that it's sort of a rejection of teleology in many ways. So, yeah. Have you considered listening to Eastern Brothers? I found an interesting podcast called The Lord of Spirits. Moresso talking about the spiritual world. Would you be interested to you? Yeah. Send it, put in video requests, Shadow. I'll definitely check it out. um, they didn't know the men were angels. Yeah, but it doesn't matter, does it? I don't think that matters so much, Shadow. I think it's more of the fact that they've seen angels come down and their instant response is, let's rape those guys. Let's rape these strangers or whatever. You've got strangers in your house and they're like, let's rape them. And then God's like, I'm going to nuke this place. Like, that's like, I'm going to fucking nuke them, man. If the Bible says a man lays down with another man, it be an abomination, not dogma. That is your religion. The interpretation of the Bible is really important. Yeah. Suggests that how we interpret the Bible's often in relation to love. When you think about what's the most loving, and I do think that there's, in terms of maybe older societies, points about whether it would be appropriate to have homosexuality or even just have and even just how you self-relate, like there's points to be made there that I don't think make that I think we can see, okay, we do need children, we do need to think about the good of broader society, not our specific interests. But as Catholics, we also need to recognize that loving marriages are the necessary prerequisite for procreation, for it to make any sense, such that, again, this is sort of obviously very much not just in relation to the Old Testament, but to the New Testament, such that our number one goal is to love thy neighbor, and it defines our lives. And the unitive act of marriage is defined by this ability to will each other's good, and homosexuals can't will the good of a heterosexual who they're in a relationship with. So, like, at least not completely. So they are unable to have a heterosexual relationship, and in which case they're unable to engage in a procreative act, which would make it a duty. And so I would say that it's not their fault that they can live happy and loving lives and express a positive spiritual relationship in a homosexual relations, such that they love their partner and unify to the greatest degree possible without engaging in a reproductive act. But could also adopt. I don't think that it would necessarily go against Christian teaching, none at all. I'm not saying dogma can just change, Mario, but I do think that in the way in which dogma progresses, it can progress linearly. Dogma can progress, it necessarily has to, such that is that not really the message of Christ, such that the laws themselves were, the fulfillment of the laws themselves are found within the greatest commandment of all, which is in love. And that's why as Catholics and Christians, we don't follow the specific laws of Judaism, literally meaning the laws and the many laws that they gave. I mean, in fact, I actually think that for example, like this was actually my local church recently. This is today actually. So this is from like Mass. It's talking about like good teachers. We are told that Jesus taught with authority and power. The Jews were a people who used the teaching of the scribes and the rabbis, who used scripture as a tool to impose the law of the Torah on the people. They had many laws covering almost every aspect of daily life, but they were simple rules without love, barriers, not bridges. Jesus came down to tear the barriers and build new bridges. He came not to change the law, but to fill it by the warmth and the love of God. And that's really what I'm trying to say in terms of the progression of our interpretation of dogma. Not a tearing down of the old, but a progression built upon it.
B super chatted £3.94. Thoughts on being voluntarily childless and instead devoting your time to other things that help communities?
Thank you very much for the donation. I think that being voluntarily childless is fine. I don't think that everyone necessarily has to reproduce. I don't think it's suitable for everyone to reproduce. You mightn't be in the right place for it. You mightn't be able to do it, and it mightn't be a way in which you could dedicate your life lovingly to others. So I don't think that everyone should necessarily reproduce or should be forced to reproduce. Reproduction should be an act of love and not one of mere obligation, right? That being said, I think that if you can, and the only thing stopping you is a kind of selfishness, not necessarily a a higher duty or a higher calling or an inability to perform the act or something like that, then you are being selfish. Like if what's stopping you is like, let's say you're wealthy enough to have children, let's say you aren't devoting your life to some sort of higher spiritual purpose or whatever, or charity or whatever, and such that you wouldn't be able to look after children whilst also maintaining your other obligations. And instead you're just looking to sort of self-satisfy. I think then that's just vice and greed, and what really needs to change is the vice and greed such that you would even be able to be a parent, right? And I would say that's a bad way to self-relate in general. It's harmful. But thank you for the donation. Where am I in the right? Okay. Can you see under capitalism telling someone can you see under capitalism telling someone who has a phone, wears clothes, drives a car, all the things that have horrific immorality to me, kind of seems hypocritical to call someone immoral because he's not a vegan in capitalism. I'm just not that individualistic. I think that it's ludicrous. I think that the socialist sort of like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism thing is a filthy cop out. Like I don't know what to tell you. I think that ultimately ethical consumerism is an obligation, and the development of movements to call into question certain areas of the economy is actually in line, if not an obligation, to a social ethical stance. That in a socialist ethical stance, that it is that if the idea of worker strikes and civil disobedience and all of that is a positive thing because it essentially brings forth through the materiality that runs society, the interests of the population, then so does a boycott, and so does a movement in which you avoid perpetuating and paying into unjust systems. But more than that, one side, in the socialist side, is a rejection of the whole system. And in many ways, there's things about it that's noble. Yes, these are problems, but it's not something that can be solved by just clicking your fingers, and it's not something that we can just easily resolve. However, with the case of veganism and animal liberation, you can entirely annihilate this sector, which is largely unprofitable, totally dependent upon government subsidies, such that a combination of political pressure and economic boycotts would be way more successful than any form of revolution or civil disobedience or even worker movement. So there's that sense. It's more pragmatically possible. It's more it's more rational. In terms of having the capacity to boycott other market products, right? Like, okay, I agree. It would be good to boycott unjust supply chains. And I do really. I think that's a good thing. I agree for a broader consideration of ethical consumerism. So, for example, if you know that if you can buy more ethically obtained clothes and products, you should. You should boycott those products which are highly unethical, and to the best of your ability. I think that this line of thinking ends up to the point of an appeal to futility, which is essentially a logical fallacy. An appeal to futility when there's no futility there, and to the point in which you get people like Vosh arguing for essentially allowing the perpetuation of an industry which rapes children as being morally equivalent to buying a computer or buying clothes, despite trying to do so in an ethical way. So you might only buy electronics that you need for business, or when you buy electronics, you might buy them from, like secondhand first. You might try to mediate your interests in relation to the lived experiences of others, but you're not going to be like being a non-vegan, which is perpetuating a preference above the vital interests of billions of others and then appeal to futility. Because if you do that, then you're not a socialist either. If you just like act as a capitalist, and I had this conversation with Vosh, if you just act as a capitalist and it doesn't actually change how you behave, then you're a capitalist and you call yourself a socialist. And that is Vosh, a capitalist who calls himself a socialist. Same as Hassan, right? Like champagne socialists, if you will. They're filthy hypocrites, and I haven't got the time of day for them. But, what can I say? Like, I think that it's just showmanship. So, do you adhere to the view that the Austrian School of Economics definition of socialism is erroneous because a purely capitalist economy has never existed for longer than a few months before turning into failed states? I wouldn't say it's you can't really say it's erroneous in itself. I think that it's sort of an internal definition, right? You can't say it's an incoherent definition. You might say it's never existed, but it's not erroneous as a definition. So like they might say that this isn't all capitalist, and that's fine. We're just using different words. I think that economics is terrible, but that's a separate point, isn't it? Um, how is egoism a rejection of teleology? Well, because egoism is essentially built up from a relationship to. It depends upon the egoist, by the way, but typically egoists take their desires to be a given, such that the end is already isn't defined by a way of self-relating, such that they need to discover their ends or actualize a specific good, or anything like that, in relation to a kind of what would make them what they are, such that they have to what's the right way, that they have to align themselves with a specific kind of natural functioning. Typically the egoist will say that their will is defined by their will towards pre-given desires, which are manifest in their own particular being, in their own particular psyche, which they have direct access to. You're usually going to see a rejection of a kind of robust human nature, and maybe a kind of mechanistic account of human behavior, atypically. I'm not say all egoists have to be like that, but it's typical, especially people like Hobbesians. Um, Man, Maximo, all you ask is questions about gayness these days, man. Like, it's every time. I just want you to know that. You only chime in to say something about homosexuality now. I'm convinced you're gay. That is the only explanation. PP, why did Christ teach about heterosexual relations but didn't mention any homosexual ones? I mean, he taught broadly about proper sexual relations in general, in the sense that even we could agree that the ones that are applicable to heterosexual relations would be as applicable to homosexual ones. We can see the heterosexuality as essentially fundamental for homosexuality to be understood, since heterosexuality is the basis of the procreative act from which the species exists, such so that it sort of defines sexual relations as a kind of bedrock. So if it's applicable to heterosexual relations, it's applicable to sexual relations. So I don't think there's a reason why Christ would necessarily have to teach on homosexual relations. And Christ didn't specifically say to that we must avoid homosexual relations in general forever, right? So, or that there couldn't be a good homosexual relation. So yeah. What is the best argument that would make an egoist a vegan? I would say, I'd say the best arguments would, I mean, from egoist position would be one's relation to self-preservation. So you have the health benefits, you have the environmental benefits, and you have the elimination of extreme risk in things like zoonotic diseases. That's probably what I would say would be the best ways to, and that wouldn't be veganism really, that would just be a plant-based diet. You're not going to be able to convince them to, like, I don't know, not exploit animals in their spare time or something, right? I think narcissism is a growing issue. I think it's tied to our increasing hedonism in general. But I think that narcissism is a growing issue in relation to how object self-idolization, predominantly because of an inability to idolize something higher than the self within our egoistic, self-orientated framework. Hassan isn't one of those capitalist millionaires. He's got just only a $3 million mansion, basically lower class. Exactly. Hassan's basically lower class. He's one of us. Yeah, I would agree. We'll follow the manner in many ways, Mario, which I think is the spirit of the law. But it's just not the laws themselves, but the truth that was set forth in the law, such it explains and explicates our relation to one another, not the specific doctrine that's written out. It's why I also disagree with the idea of sort of an ahistorical interpretation of papal infallibility. Is it not consumerism may not be essential law? Is it not that the worst aspects of capitalism, rather than require to perpetuate income to those so engaged? I don't know, law. I'm not sure what you're saying there. The Bible got several teachings about living equably in a situation that's not equable, like in a foreign land. If it can only exist without a state or borders, then it can exist in a universe with other systems, even if the Earth became communistic. Law. Yeah, I guess, like, I see what you're saying, like, essentially, like, the sort of give on to Caesar mentality. But I don't even think that in the ideal society, for example, like, homosexuality wouldn't exist. I would probably expect it to exist, and I don't think it would be wrong. Not wrong in itself, or even in the act. If we move towards systemic use of the state and subsidize more and more ethical ways of consumption when it comes to veganism and make it cheaper and more accessible, then I would agree with that. And the individualism gets me from veganism. I mean, no, we're not individualistic, because vegans often engage in political forms of activism, trying to stop animal subsidization, like animal ethical subsidization, and promote like various alternatives, and also veganism's cheaper to do. So I don't know what to tell you. Like, it's cheaper to be a vegan than an omnivore. So like there's no real excuse. It's not individualistic. It's a grassroots movement. And if you think that's individualistic, then I don't see why you'd be a socialist. Like, and like, even, what isn't it? Karl Marx said that the like communism would be essentially the freedom of the individual. That it represents the individual, the freedom of the individual would be its fundamental principle or guiding principle. So it's like there has to be a kind of individual consideration there, right? I have a friend who's an egoist and all his endeavors, but if asked, he'll tell you about all his rich moral framework. I think it speaks to the levels some people are capable of self-deception. Oh, 100%. Self-deception's a real thing. 100%. I just lost that. Where's it? PP, why did Jesus not teach the truth of modern quantum mechanics? Checkmate, Christian. 100% Hound. I don't know why. Like, clearly, a flawed system. What are we doing? Is pleasure seeking a guilty and sinful practice? No, I don't think so. Pleasure seeking for its own sake, without the consideration of others and a moral law, yes. Pleasure seeking, for the good of all, no. $3 million mansion in LA is for trash collectors. Bloody hell, I hope not. I mean, I've seen Hassan's house. It's a pretty fucking good house, man. Classless, stateless, moneyless system requires no other existing systems which no other existing system would have a border with. Yeah, maybe I'm not sure. Hassan uses a lot of his wealth, time, and effort to push for leftist values, funding politicians, union organized striking fund, charity for Gaza. What do you want from him? To live his socialist values in a cardboard box? I mean, I just don't want him to be a filthy capitalist. I don't know what to tell you. Like, I do actually expect him to limit any spending, and I mean, live in a cardboard box, man. I've seen the car the man drives, and like he wears like $600 shirts and lives in a $3 million mansion. I don't know what the fuck like you expect. Like, or like, yeah, I expect him to live like a middle class life. Like, God forbid, I don't. I like, is that not good enough? And I also expect him to pay his editors. I expect him to actually pay people for the value they produce in order to live in a socialist way. Even give them. So, for example, I've got an editor at the minute on YouTube. He's just like really started working with us, and I'm giving him. Like, I'm not making very much in terms of AdSense at the minute, obviously being such a small channel, but he's getting 100% of the AdSense to a certain point, then we're 50-50 in, because it's essentially revenue sharing, which is a socialist position to have. And I would expect someone like Hassan to maybe try something like that, or, even just pay them especially when he's rich as shit. In terms of his relationship to Gaza, I think that's actually exposed him to be incredibly biased and awful. I think that his positions on Gaza are very one-sided, and I think he is using the tragedy to, and I think that he uses pretty much all of these political systems and ideologies in order to gain self-advantage, the same as Vosh. Do I really care about that? Not so much. But I don't think that he lives by the values he preaches, especially when he's, wearing t-shirts like "Eat the Rich." And yeah, like, it's not as if he's calling for, and in terms of, charitable sort of events, like, I think that he engages in charity largely for his own gain. I think that the way he engages with people in general is sort of one-sided. I think he seems politically terrible, and yeah, I don't know. I just wish he wouldn't be a hypocrite. I don't know what to tell you. Like, I'm not. I don't know what to tell you. I think the guy's a hypocrite. He didn't pay his editors. I think he started to pay his editors. It was only but he was huge when he wasn't paying his editors. I want him to make more money that he can continue to help leftist movements in our system. I love this shit. I hate this stupidity. I want him to make more money so he can sorry, but it is like I want him to make more money so you can continue to help leftist movements in our system. When you equalize power, don't make yourself irrelevant by living your values. Well, you don't make yourself irrelevant by living your values. The way in which he's using power is perpetuating capitalist capitalist commodity fetishism. He literally takes photos of himself with flash cars, big houses, and essentially porn stars. So like the guy lives and breathes the capitalist ideal. The right, in order to like challenge the system, you would need an ideological shift, and the guy is definitely not helping an ideological shift. What he is helping is his own back pocket, whilst also appearing to be noble. And like you can get what's called a noble narcissist, and I think that's probably Hassan. I don't know what to say, but if you're not paying your editors, but you're preaching socialism, man. I'm not a Zionist. I actually think both sides are horrifically terrible in terms of Gaza and Israel. You know, I make a joke all the time on the channel. I'm a Deus Vult. You know, we'll let the Catholic Church clearly should own both Israel and Palestine. If we just resurrect the kingdom of Jerusalem, all will be solved. Do you not understand this? No, I mean, obviously I'm joking, but my granda was actually in the Hotel David when it was bombed by the Israelis. He was a UN peacekeeper, and he was very critical of Israelis. He witnessed war crimes. I'm very well aware that the Israelis have committed war crimes, and I think that the deals that have been made, that they've been forced into boxes, that the situation hasn't been fair and just. I don't think that the Israelis have been fair. Likewise, I think the Palestinians also need to learn how to cohabitate and respect the Israelis. I think that the perpetuation of the separation of the two peoples has become concrete and cemented, that both sides have committed war crimes and violated various treaties and obligations they've had to each other. I think that they hate each other and neither side is looking for peace. Truly, there are people on both sides who are looking for peace, but between the IDF and Hamas, I don't have the time of day for either of them, I guess. So I don't know what to tell you. And it's not like Hamas isn't popular in Palestine, and it's not like the people on perpetuating violence. And likewise, it's not like the IDF is coming out of nowhere from the Israelis. I really don't like both sides, and I think that when we're looking at a complex political history, pointing the fingers just to Israel is nonsense. It's clearly more than just Israel. So yeah. He pays his editors now, but he didn't used to. Don't care how he lives and shares his profit. Like, what do you mean you don't care how he lives and shares his profit? That's like the fundamental tenets of socialism. Like, what do you mean you don't care about how he lives and shares his profit? Like, that's like saying about any other capitalist. I don't care about how this person who agrees with me lives and shares his profit, even if he goes and contravenes all of the values that, like, we actually stand for. It's not about that. It's, it doesn't matter. Are you absolutely ridiculous? Like, I don't know what, like, what's wrong with you? Of course that's wrong. Like, he's making a mockery out of socialism. He's not helping it. He has funded what I would call actual leftist values. Uh, let's have a look. I'm I can see Hassan was one of the biggest donators to the world to the Amazon Labor Union. It doesn't show how much he's donated. I mean, he's fundraised. Um, I don't count fundraising as him donating personally. I count that as him fundraising. Fundraising's good. I'm not going to argue with that. Do I think that it has anything to do with him being a socialist? No, like not really. Um, Especially considering the biggest problem that we have in terms of the application of socialism isn't just material, it's ideological association. Um, the middle class basically drops the lower class um, in terms of worker movements. So, yeah, like the problem is people like Hassan get wealthy and then don't perpetuate systems which would disadvantage themselves and instead seek to protect their assets and their wealth whilst abandoning the people below them. Nothing will change by a particular capitalist if the system doesn't change. It ain't gonna. Well, I don't disagree, but I think the way that systems change is by having people who are willing to engage it personally, like in terms of their own private lives, and live their and engage publicly. So I engage as a socialist, and I would publicly engage as a socialist if I'm a socialist. If I am a capitalist, I'll do the same. If I'm a Christian, I do the same, right? Like, there's something very strange about a Christian who gives to church but then goes home and worships Satan. Like, that's not a Christian. Just like a socialist who goes and lives as a capitalist isn't a capitalist if they go and live the life of a isn't a socialist if they go and live the life of a capitalist. Like, it doesn't make sense. Just because he either gives money or puts on a social performance doesn't make him essentially even ethically expressive of the movement. It just makes him a political shill. Like, I don't know what to say. There is no both siding what is happening now that makes you a liberal, buddy. I mean, I'm not a liberal, but I think liberalism's the highest form of the highest political system, like the best political system we've managed to construct so far, since it actually represents the rights of individuals within society. And I mean, Karl Marx basically said something similar to that. So, like, like, um, I mean, I don't think, calling us a liberal wouldn't really insult us that much. It's like, well, yeah, like, I mean, Hassan's being a liberal, actually. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Like, he's the most that's the most liberal thing ever. Like, calling for redistribution whilst enriching yourself via the means of promoting redistribution. It's just liberalism. Where am I? I actually lost my place in the bloody chat. Bro, why be a socialist if you can't own a mansion and a designer sweatshop clothes? I don't know, man. Like, what am what can I say? Like, what's the point? Why even bother if you can't live the fanciest, flashiest life possible? Why should we? Didn't he deride Mr. Beast for donating to get people eye operations so they could see whilst believing his own fundraising is great? That sounds about right. That sounds about right. And it is the same thing as Mr. Beast, and I don't think Mr. Beast is a socialist. But he's fostering real change. That's where you have to understand. These people who are given their eyesight back, they're never going to amount to anything. They're never going to change the political system, right? What he's fostering is real grassroots movements which are going to change the political system in the United States forever. He's definitely not selling people a pipe dream, and he's definitely not perpetuating a standard which directly contravenes that and promoting a fetishistic ideal which is directly undermining it. We should all buy his merch. That's what we should do. Donate to Hassan, leader of the free people of leader of the free socialists. I'm not doing call-ins right now, Maximo. I'm sorry. Sorry, dude, I'm not doing call-ins right now. You'll have to catch us when I'm doing call-ins. He's opening people's eyes metaphorically. That's right. Like, you can't think about this in actual terms of change, right? Mr. Beast is literally the Antichrist. Read Revelation. He's literally fulfilling every prophecy. I saw the whole Mr. Beast is the Antichrist. I love that stuff, man. What is it? Mr. Beast is like the fun, like there was like one is called Mr. Beast. Like it's like I was like, I'm sold, man. That's some pretty hard evidence right there and then. Like it's Mr. Beast. Actually, would the Antichrist reveal himself as Mr. Beast? Would he just call himself Mr. Beast, but but subvert like morality through irony anyways? Yes, I mean that's the whole thing of the Antichrist, isn't it? Like, no man, 100%. Yeah, Mr. Beast the Antichrist makes perfect sense. The guy's definitely going to be like the next Walt Disney or something though, 100%. Last to take their hand off the church goes to heaven. Absolutely, man. But I had to have the mansion to stream. It's for work. Yeah, exactly. What does a socialist life under capitalism look like? Who writes those rules? Well, I mean, you'd actually have to live by the founding principles, right? Not actually perpetuate, like, essentially, like for example, like deliberately exploiting labor forces to the nth degree would be bad. I even had this debate with like Vosh where I said, why don't you just, even if you were to, like, let's say you're a landlord, you wouldn't go to the highest market rate. You would try and undercut the market to the point in what's an actual sustainable amount for you to have. Now that might be the market rate, it might not be. You also not be a slumlord. You'll try and at least help your tenants. Even if you are going to have to engage in those systems in order to essentially survive and protect your wealth, such that you have, money for growing older and stuff like that, the way in which you engage in the systems would reflect the fact that you think that they're primarily for the social good. So like you wouldn't just evict someone because you can get a higher rate of rent, like a no-fault eviction or something. And there's just like, it's just like this clearly ethical mandates that would be applicable to a socialist that wouldn't be applicable to a capitalist, because they would just say that they don't acknowledge them as real ethical mandates, right? Classical liberals have been wrongly interpreted, and we don't have an academic system. We have a system of rich versus everyone else. Yeah, I mean the classical liberals are actually, I don't know. I think classical liberals are pretty great. I don't know if they're wrongly interpreted. I think maybe it's by. I don't think that. I don't know. It depends on what you mean. I do think that the rich control everything, but that's unsurprising, isn't it? Is the socialist worker not entitled to the sweat of his brow? And the fact that he actually quoted Ayn Rand, like not Ayn Rand, the fucking Bioshock meme of like Ayn Rand, man. Like, is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? Like, was it man not entitled to the? It was just absolutely. It's absolutely mad that he actually quoted that. Who quotes that as a socialist? Quotes fucking Bioshock, like Rapture. Like, it's just absolutely maddening. Like, he's laughing in our faces. Like, he has to be. It has to be an absolute like con. He can't be serious. There's no way that Hassan could quote that and actually just be so dumb. I understand he's basically a himbo. Right, and his popularity is very much tied to the fact that he's a good-looking man. But you cannot meaningfully just quote that. And as a socialist, Bioshock is based. Bioshock is such a good game. Oh, hiya, Shadow. How you doing, man? It's a primary work. Man hasn't read Karl Marx, but he's played Bioshock, right? Which shows why socialism is not going to work. Like how you can twist bourgeois consumerism as spreading the good word of socialism takes some delusion. I mean, like, that's actually how it works, though. That's how capitalism subverts socialism, right? Like how it's universal. That's like kind of the, you buy a Che Guevara t-shirt to feel like a revolutionary. It's just like, It's not a con. He's just not a very well-read dude. I just think the guy, I don't know, man. Tiny Rogues is as good as Brotato. Really? Really? Okay, once I'm going to check that out. Brotato's so fucking good. Tiny Rogues. Tiny Rogues. It's a very similar kind of game. I'll probably get it. Early access game. I'll give that a go, man. I'll definitely give that a go. Most of these internet socialists are just socially progressive liberals, if that. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, like, I think that's it. Like, I'm not even saying that's wrong. I just, like, I'm gonna just be honest with ourselves. Right? You know what I mean? Like, come on, man. I think it's the United States because of the way that socialism's been conflated in the United States, such that, like, if you are just a progressive liberal, then you're a socialist. You've been playing the crap out of it. Well, I'll definitely take it on board after Brotato, because Brotato is like, it's peak, man. Brotato's actually so good. It's such a good game. Okay, guys, I think we've had a nice Q&A for tonight. I think I'm going to bounce. So check out my free webinar, which will teach you the best and worst ways to start your philosophical journey so you can find the best and avoid the worst. It also comes with a free downloadable PDF, which explains a reading list, how to start your philosophical journey. And it even comes with like tick boxes so you can tick off as you go along. And I've got honorable mentions in there and everything. And it takes you all the way from the classics to the contemporaries in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. So check that out. The link is in the description. And if you're on Twitch, it's in the YouTube description. It's in the YouTube homepage. And yeah, follow, subscribe, like the stream, do all that good stuff. And as always, everyone, try to gain some perspective. Have a good night, everyone.